Hi, I'm Jonathan Weinberg, and this is Drawing with Fountain Pens. If you follow this channel, you know that I talk a lot about Pelikan pens. Last week I just talked about hosting the 2024 Pelikan Hub, and I frequently talk about the Pelikan M800 as my favorite pen. Well, I thought, a lot of people can't afford hundreds and hundreds of dollars for such a pen, and I thought that I would look into one of the Chinese pens that, let's say, emulates the Pelikan M800. This is the Hong Dian N12, and I got it in this orange color, as you're going to see, because it looks very much like the orange of the M600 that I have, but the size of the pen is very similar to my favorite pen, the Pelikan M800, and I wanted to see, what do you get for around $25? Depends on when you buy it. If you buy it on eBay, if you buy it on AliExpress, how much you pay for this piston filler pen. Now, keep in mind right from the start that the nib on a pen like this, which is a steel nib and is a fine nib, is not going to write like even one of the least expensive of the Pelikan M line, the M200. It's just not going to be as smooth and as fine as that. So that's, spoiler alert, that's, I'll let you realize that. But in other ways, it's a nice value. It's a nice pen, and I'll compare the two, and we'll see how they differ. And then at the end, I'll do a little drawing using the pen. I like it. As always, if you find this video useful, don't forget to subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, and it's the way to support the channel. So I got my version of the pen on Amazon. It came in this box. A lot of the Hong Dian pens come in a box like this, which is nice. It's very plain, but it does a good job of securing, keeping the pen in place. And it had this little plastic sleeve. The one extra thing that came with the pen is a little wrench that you wouldn't get with the Pelikan, which allows you to take the pen apart, and clean it, give it a very thorough clean. So that's a nice thing that they include that in the pen. Here you can see it there. And here it is. I'm going to put it next to the M800, and you can see that it is very similar in size. The M800, the Souverain pen, they have a very similar clip. The M800, of course, has a clip that looks like a Pelikan's beak. It's more substantial, I would say, than the clip that you're getting on the $20 pen. That's no surprise. And this is actually very stiff clip, but very similar. Doesn't have all the detail. You'll notice that they both have bands, but doesn't have the two bands. So, this is an example of a pen that you almost can say it's an homage. It's not an exact copy. It certainly doesn't say, it's not trying to fool you. On the pen, it says that it's Hong Dian. It says that it's the N12 on it, so it's not trying to be the Pelikan. And yet, of course, it's very similar. Now, when you look at, there are several companies actually that are now making pens that I would say emulate different Pelikan pens. But one thing that none of these companies do is copy the stripes of the Pelikan pen, which is so notable and iconic. It's hard to see this, but on the camera, but this is actually translucent, so you can see through the pen. And in the older versions of the pen, this is a pen from the 1990s, the M800 from the 1990s, is actually, the material, I believe, is a kind of celluloid. The newer versions of the pen are not as translucent in the same way as this is. So actually, it's one of the reasons for trying to, if you can, find an M800 that is older. So anyway, they're almost exactly the same size, so that's similar. The finial is similar, but not quite the same. Doesn't quite as much as sort of like a cap, a hat, the way the Pelikan has a kind of hat. And then you see the, of course, very distinctive Pelikan logo with the little chicks on the top. It's far more elaborate. It's a much heavier, substantial pen. And here they actually do have a little bird on the cap here, I think, which is again sort of signaling to you that this is a homage to the Pelikan line. Now, in terms of the material, I have an M600, which is actually smaller, but it is a very similar kind of color. And I would say that the Pelikan orange material is a little nicer, has a little more sort of shine to it, than the Hong Dian version of it. But this is really quite lovely. I think the material of the orange here is really quite lovely. It's not, neither of these I think are as beautiful as the classic green stripes or blue stripes or gray stripes of the Souverain line. You can see, I hope you can see that this too is translucent, and so you can sort of see the ink coming into it. And of course, this is a piston filler, and the M line are all piston fillers. Now, one thing Hong Dian does get right that is very smart is when you post it, it posts very securely, it does not turn the piston, and that's very important that it do that. There's no reason why any piston pen should not do that, and unfortunately, I'm not going to name names, there are piston pens out there that when you post them and you touch the cap or you pull the cap off in the wrong way, it actually turns the piston and gets ink all over your hands. You can see that it does have a steel nib, but the nib is gold plated, so it gives it a kind of looks like it's a gold nib, but it isn't a nib. Unfortunately, the pen only came in extra fine and fine. I'm not a big fan, at least for writing, of those sizes. I would prefer a broad or a medium, but it does, when I write with it, it does write pretty smoothly. In terms of the nib size, the nib in this pen seems to be somewhere between a really number 5 and a number 6 nib. Hong Dian unfortunately uses, well, it's not unfortunate because their nibs are fine, but they make their own nibs and they don't correspond to, let's say, Jovo nibs. So it's not an easy thing to just take a Jovo number 6 nib and put it into a Hong Dian pen. And for this model pen, they only seem to make an extra fine and a fine nib. To me, that's too bad, because I could see getting this pen and putting a different nib in it, and that would be a way to improve it. Although, as I say, this nib is perfectly okay. In defense of Pelikan, the nibs that Pelikans use are also made by them and are not swappable with other pen companies, nib companies. But the thing is, the Pelikan nibs are so fantastic that I think you wouldn't want to swap them. So that is a difference, and actually the size is very similar. Although you can't take the screw-in Pelikan and screw that into the Hong Dian. They're not compatible and clones in that sense. But you can get Hong Dian replacement nibs on Amazon and eBay. In terms of weight, it is around 25.5 grams. That's with ink in it. That compares with the M800, which is almost 29 grams. So this is a heavier pen. Here's the newer version of the Pelikan M800. Let's see, similar, 29 grams. So both of these M800 pens are heavier. If we look at the M600, that's considerably lighter. So that's 18 grams. So it's somewhere, as you would guess, it's heavier than the M600, but not as heavy as a standard Pelikan M800. As I've said before, size-wise, they're almost exactly the same, around 5.5 inches. When we post them, they become 6.25 inches. It's interesting to see them this way, and you notice how the section on the N12 is much longer, and there's this sort of interesting step up that you don't get in the Pelikan version of this pen. How does it write? Hong Dian, and this is the N12, and it is a fine. It comes in extra fine and fine. This is diamine, mean oxblood, which is a nice color. This is rhodia paper. And it doesn't have any line variation. It has some feedback, but it's not bad. You know, it's particularly, this is a fine pen, so it's going to have more feedback. But actually, even with this feedback, I would say that's okay. You know, it actually reminds me a bit of a sailor pen, a sailor nib, rather than a nib like the Pelikan nib, which is very, very smooth. Like a lot of Chinese pens, though, it writes very, very well right out of the box. No trouble with ink flow. It's quite wet. You can hear the feedback, but it's not skipping or anything. So it's you know, for a pen that's a little more than $20, it's great. It's fine. It's nice, and particularly if you like this orange, or it comes in different colors. If you prefer, you might prefer this to the stripes of a Pelikan pen. Although when Pelikan introduces special editions of its pens, they come in many different varieties, but then they tend to be very, very expensive, even more expensive than the regular line. So this is a nice pen, I would say, particularly if you want to try out the size of a Pelikan pen, see if it's something you might want. If you're someone who likes a nib that has feedback, this is a good choice. And I really like this, by the way. I really like this ink color. The oxblood diamine ink is always really terrific. So I recommend this pen, but it is no M800, which in terms of its nib, the smoothness, I mean, I go on and on about it in many different videos. There is nothing quite like the way in which it writes. I think Doug also, on his, when it comes to the M800, there is no pen that I know of that writes so smoothly, with such pleasure, and the quality of the pen is really, to me, is very much worth it. But for a lot of people, the $400 or more that pen costs is too much, and this is a nice choice. I was recently in Kent Falls, and I think that would make a nice test of the pen. So, in conclusion, I did have some issues with the pen when I was drawing with it. It writes fine. I mean, I've used it in journaling and writing. It's fine. But when I was drawing with it, I noticed two things. One thing is that I noticed, although, it posts fairly well, that it had a tendency to sort of slip a little bit when I was drawing with it. You have to really make sure you get it in there when you post it. And then the other thing is, as I was drawing very quickly with it, it did stop writing and I had to prime it. Now that is maybe a function of the fact that I was drawing very, very fast and it was, using a lot of ink. And I don't think that would happen if you were writing with the pen, but it's something to keep in mind. It's not something that has happened when I've used the Pelikan pen to draw with, or with one more expensive Pilot pen. That's the pens that I really like to draw with. They keep up. This sort of gave out halfway through because I was drawing with it so furiously. I don't think that would happen, as I say, when you were writing with it. So it's something to keep in mind, depending on, it's always true, what you're going to use the pen for. If you don't mind a bit of feedback, the nib is fine. The piston, it's nice to have a piston pen in such an inexpensive pen, and I think the orange color is quite nice. As always, if you find this useful, please subscribe, and that's the way to support the channel. It's free. I'll see you next time.